Hey everyone, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about wire. So what is wire? Wire is a typically insulated electrical conductor that is used to carry current. We're going to look through wire gauge and how that relates to size, what the conductor is and why that's important, what the insulation is and why it's important, and then how to choose each of those based on your build. So I'm going to just give general information and facts and then walk you through how to pick what you need for your specific situation. So first up, wire gauge. The wire gauge that I'm using here is AWG, American Wire Gauge. There are other wire gauge standards out there. SWG is one of them. That's the British Imperial Standard Wire Gauge. Sizes between different wire gauge standards are not the same. So 22 AWG is not the same as 22 SWG. You're going to see a different diameter on the conductor. And when you talk about wire gauge, you're not measuring the insulator. That's not included in the wire gauge. You're just talking about the size of the conductor. So when you look at a wire gauge chart, you're going to see a list of numbers with the wire gauge standard. Those numbers will then correspond to a measurement, a diameter. That diameter is not going to be the same for a different wire gauge standard. There's also some misunderstanding or confusion around how wire gauge works. 22 AWG is actually smaller than 18 AWG. And that seems backwards because normally when you talk about size, a larger number is going to be a larger gauge, but that's not the case with wire. And the reason being is the manufacturing process. When wire is manufactured, they have a stock size that's larger than the final size. That stock is pulled through plates that size the wire down, and they keep account of the number of times that wire is sized down. That number then is used to describe the wire gauge. With solid core, they're sizing down to the single strand. With stranded wire, they're sizing down to each individual strand, and then when you put those strands together, they're going to equal whatever size wire it is that you're looking at. So the total diameters of each strand adds up to the diameter that corresponds to the wire gauge. The simplest way to relate that back to functionality in a circuit, this 22 AWG or the stranded 22 AWG, they'll carry the same amount of current, but they're going to carry less current than 18 AWG. And that's something you need to keep in mind when you're purchasing wire. We'll get to that towards the end of the video. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the conductor. Copper is a very common conductor in wire. You will see other materials. Here you'll even notice that this is copper and this is copper. But these are also copper. They're just plated with silver. So are these. That's why they have the silver color on each of the strands, and I'll give you a close-up example of what that looks like. You can see on the right, this is copper. On the left here, we've got silver. If you were to look at this in person, you would see that each strand is copper on the end where it's been cut. Copper or silver-plated copper or tin-plated copper are all going to work just fine. And then the last part about conductors that we're going to go over, they either come in solid core or stranded. The advantage to having stranded when you're building sabers is that it's much more flexible. So take this 22 AWG wire that's stranded, for instance. I'm applying just enough pressure to hold it between my fingers, and it's flexing that much. But if I do the same thing with the solid core of the same size, you'll notice that it doesn't flex at all. But the same amount of pressure is being applied to both of these wires. Therein lies the advantage to stranded wire when you're building in limited space. Now, there are instances, very, very few of them, where this might come into play when you're building a saber. but 99% or more of the time, you're going to want stranded wire. I'm going to make a broad assumption and assume that the saber building community is one of very many that debate insulation type, even more than they offer varying opinions on what wire gauge should be used, which we will be getting to that in a little bit, but wire gauge is not really up for debate. There are certain rules you need to abide by, or you're going to see extremely unfortunate consequences. Damage to electronic components that you will dearly miss and would rather not be replacing. You'll see I put PVC insulation here and here. So these 4 wires all have PVC insulation. This wire has silicone insulation, and these 2 wires have Ptfe insulation. PVC stands for polyvinyl chloride, and Ptfe stands for polytetrafluoroethylene. PVC insulation is the most common. If you look at wire and it doesn't have an insulation type in its description, you're most likely looking at PVC. Silicone is usually a little bit more costly, and Ptfe, if you're coming from PVC and moving to Ptfe, there's going to be a little bit of sticker shock. It's a bit of a jump in price, but to me it's worth it, and I'm not going to sway you one way or another, but I'll get back to why I use Ptfe. PVC and silicone, these examples I have here are scrap that I happen to have laying around. I used to use PVC insulation. I have used solid core on a few projects, which is why I have that, not Saber builds for other things. The difference between these insulators comes into play when you're talking about how much space you have for your installation, how much heat resistance you want your insulation to have, abrasion resistance, and your budget. So first I'll demonstrate the difference in heat resistance. I'll show you the extremes. PVC, when you touch a soldering iron to it that is 342 degrees, it begins to melt. And if I were to hold it there long enough and run it around that wire would be void of insulation in no time. However, Ptfe coating at 340 Celsius, which is normally where I solder most components, Ptfe is not going to see any melting at that temperature. Same is going to be true with this 22 AWG, which is also Ptfe insulation. Abrasion resistance. PVC is a fairly durable coating when you're talking about abrasion resistance. So if I take an X-Acto blade and I scrape against the PVC, you'll see shavings come off of it. But it would take a while for that to wear down. The place you're going to see that kind of rough abrasion is on the threads of a Saber body when wires are being pulled across it. So if you're pulling your chassis in and out or pulling your components in and out, you're going to see a bit of abrading. And after a long time or a lot of rough handling, it could wear it down enough to where you expose the conductor on the inside and the insulation is no longer going to do its job. Your circuit's going to have a short in it when you get metal on metal contact there. Silicone. You're going to see about the same abrasion resistance as PVC, but it's a little bit softer. So it'll shave down a little bit faster than PVC will. Ptfe is extremely tough. Now, don't get me wrong, it can still be scraped away, but the same amount of pressure and the same action here that I apply to the PVC is scraping away far less insulation. The other two parts of this that we're going to talk about have to do with the amount of installation space you're working with. PVC is perfectly fine if you have a lot of space, but if you don't, you may prefer silicone or Ptfe. And the reason being, one, this might be more flexible than solid core insulation, but if you were to try to bend this into a little ball, it offers some resistance. If you try to bend silicone into a ball, it offers no resistance. And once it's in that little shape, it holds it much better than PVC because it's not as rigid. That insulation is much more malleable. Ptfe is not nearly as good at conforming to installation spaces as silicone is, but it is still pretty flexible. Because it's a very hard coating, it's closer to PVC insulation. But the advantage to Ptfe is how small the insulation is. Just to give a direct comparison to both silicone and PVC, this 28 AWG Ptfe is 0.027 inches or 0.686 millimeters, and that's the diameter on the outside of the insulation. Just to show you that that's accurate, I measured this, it's not an off-the-box measurement. On the other hand, silicone of the same size, 28 AWG, which means that the conductor on the inside of the insulation is the same size as this, the insulation here is much larger. Instead of the 0.027 inches, you're looking at 0.045 inches. Or 1.143 millimeters. And if I put these side by side, you can see that though they may have the same internal size, the same current carrying capacity, the insulations are significantly different. And then I have 22 AWG in Ptfe and 22 AWG in PVC. The PVC is 0.063 inches or 1.6 millimeters, which by the looks of that is generous. And the 22 AWG in Ptfe is 0.048 inches or 1.219 millimeters. So as you can see, PVC insulation might be on par with flexibility. Silicone might be a lot better with flexibility, but because you have a smaller size here, you have less wire to fit into a small space. So obviously, these two far surpass PVC when it comes to small spaces. And depending upon what you're looking for in your build, Ptfe and silicone have their positive and negative points, but I feel they're both better than PVC. So how do you go about choosing the wire for your installation? We're going to take solid core off the table. It's not something I'm going to recommend in a Saber build. PVC is good if your budget is low and you need something that's going to do the job but not be luxurious. Silicone is a really good option if you don't like fiddling with wires. If you want your wires to conform to the space easily such that you don't have to manipulate them just right to get your chassis or your components to fit into a tight space. Ptfe is going to be great if you want good abrasion resistance, good heat resistance, and an extremely small diameter on the outside of the insulation. All of them are going to carry current exactly the same, more or less. So as far as functionality, you're not looking at a difference, but when it comes to the space and the conditions that your wire is going to be put under, you need to think about that before making your purchase. And if you're considering moving from one insulation to another or trying one out, I would suggest buying a small amount, seeing if you like it, and then purchasing a larger bulk amount. And then just to review before we go into current carrying capacity, larger conductors, down here 18 AWG, that's a large conductor, the small number, allows more current flow. And smaller 26 AWG, for instance, is a smaller conductor, and it allows less current flow. So what does that mean for Saber building specifically? I'm going to throw a chart up right now so that you guys can look at it. And it comes from the Ptfe v2.2 manual, which, by the way, has a lot of really good information in it, despite the fact that it's for a specific Saber board. There's a lot of non-Ptfe related information in there, and that's thanks to Dmitry and Fredrik for putting that together. I'll be linking this chart down in the description, along with the webpage that was used to help build it. And if you want to follow along there, if it's easier for you to look at, that's fine. But I'm going to basically just go through what this chart means in relation to wiring up your Saber. So the two important columns here are going to be on the left, AWG gauge, that's your wire gauge, ranging from 14 all the way up to 32. And on the far right, maximum amps for chassis wiring, ranging from 32 up to 0.53. And that just means the amount of current that can be passed through that wire safely. Then you'll notice that gray areas have been added, and they run in rows across these wire gauges. The first section being neopixel strips, battery, recharge port, kill switch, and it covers gauges 18 through 22. And then below it, Cree LED, battery, recharge port, kill switch, 24 through 28, and everything else 30 through 32. The reason that there are corresponding sizes with those labels is to do with what size wire you need for the components that are listed. So your neopixel blade needs to have at least 22 gauge wire. Your battery, when you're using a neopixel, needs to have 22 gauge wire because your neopixel blade is pulling the amount of current from the battery. The wires coming from the battery need to be able to carry as much current as is being sent to your neopixel blade. Your recharge port has current flowing from the battery through it. It also needs to have the same size wire as you're using on your neopixel strips and your battery. And then your kill switch. That might be your recharge port in some cases. In other cases, you may have a separate dedicated switch. Again, that switch needs to have the same wire gauge that you're using for your neopixel strips, your battery. Now, if you add additional strips, for instance, more than 144 LEDs, multiple meters, you're going to need to go up in wire gauge. So 22 is your minimum to run a blade of 144 pixels. But if you were to use 200 pixels, you're going to need to get a larger wire. And you just make current calculations based on the current being pulled by your components. Based on those calculations, you select a wire gauge, and then that gauge has to be put between all of the components listed in the gray area. Down below, we have Cree LED, battery, recharge port, kill switch. This is the same thing, but it's using an in-hill installation of a Cree LED. The difference being Crees require less current to power them than neopixel strips do, so you don't need as large of a gauge of wire. You can get away with 28 gauge. You need to keep in mind how you're setting it up. 28 gauge can be run to each die on your Cree LED for all your negatives and your positive, but just keep in mind you don't want to go above that 28, just like you don't want to go above the 22 for the neopixel. So let me back up here and explain the exceptions to this, because there are exceptions. When you set up your Cree LED, whether it is a stunt setup, meaning just a light switch, battery, possibly a recharge port, and your resistors, or if you're using a soundboard and it's more complicated installation, The easiest way, and the way that's most commonly done, is to run a negative from each of your LED diodes back to your board or back to your power source and put a resistor on each of those lines. You can do the same with the positive and run a positive from each diode's positive back to your power source. Or you can bridge the positives near the LED and run one strand of 26 AWG back to your power source. The advantage here is you have one wire instead of three, and it takes less space overall inside the hilt. But if you do this, you have to have a larger wire gauge, 26 AWG, in order to pass the current necessary. If you have a very tight installation, you can get away with using 30 AWG instead of 28. But avoid this if you can. You're better off using 28. Do not ever go above 30 AWG. It's not going to pass nearly enough current to run your LED at full brightness. The other exception has to do with flash on clash. You have a blue die and another blue die and a white die, and you plan on running the two blue dies at full power, but the white die is just there to make the flash effect, but not to run at full power. You could get away with running a smaller wire from that die if you needed the space. But in most cases, just stick to using the same 28 AWG if you can. And then everything else, the things that fall into the category of everything else are things like your switches and your accent LEDs, your speaker, if you have a rice port, a Bluetooth module, any of those things that you're adding on in addition to the main parts of your build that are not going to be pulling as much current, you can get away with using 30 through 32. There is nothing wrong with using a larger gauge wire, but it's not necessary. This is by no means a blanket statement. You need to make calculations for your build, and if you need help with that, you can always ask. But just make sure before you start your build that you have looked through this chart and that you've taken into account anything that is not on here or that this might not directly apply to. At the bottom, you're going to see the black bar here that has NeoPixel strips build and says 3 through 17 ampere load, and then the Cree LED build 1 through 4 ampere load. 3 through 17 is your range of amps that NeoPixel strips are going to pull, and 1 through 4 is the range of amps that Cree LEDs are typically going to pull. And then you'll see 2 strip, 3 strip, 4 strip. And that's what I was talking about earlier. When you go above the regular 2 strip, you're going to need more than 22 AWG. So 3 strip, you're going to need 20. 4 strip, 18. These are good rules of thumb. If you have something that's more custom or something that goes above this for some reason, make your calculations accordingly. You'll also see it says single below 22 AWG or 24 AWG dual in parallel. And that simply means that if you want to, you can substitute 2 24 AWG wires running to the NeoPixel strip to power it rather than one wire of 22 AWG. It just gives you more space for the current to travel. Dual in parallel refers to the way that you're wiring the circuit. You're wiring 2 24 AWG wires in parallel to each other. And then when you look over at the Cree, it says 30 AWG possible for single 3-watt Cree LED wiring. Keep in mind, that is one wire per die. I have never worked with a space so tight that I needed to use 30 AWG, but occasionally you will run into that if you build a lot of Sabers. So it is a possibility, but you can only run 30 to one die at a time. And that pretty much covers it. If you guys have any questions at all about anything in this video, please ask them in the comments below or in the Saber Builders Academy Facebook group. I'm going to link that in the description along with other items that are relevant or that I've promised you already earlier in the video. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you have a great week.